Good evening, everyone, and welcome to New Jersey Performing Arts Center's gathering on behalf of Newark History Society. Tonight, we are so excited to be with you talking about Monumental Newark. I am here to introduce you to the president and co founder of Newark History Society, a partner of NJ PAX for the last 5 years. We want to thank our hosts and the opportunity for us to even bring virtual programming like this while our buildings are closed. We are on intermission, we are still programming, and we're so excited that you're here with us this evening. Thank you to ADP and M&T and all of our funders. We celebrate the opportunity to share wonderful programming with you. And now let us hear from our president and co-founder of Newark History Society, Timothy Chris. Timothy?
Well, good evening, and I'm glad to add my welcome to Aisha's. We're really pleased at the Newark History Society to have this collaboration with NJPAC that's now in its 5th year, and a special shout out to John Schreiber for being such a strong supporter of what we do, and to the entire community engagement team at NJPAC, which is working overtime these days to keep their robust virtual program series going, and have been really helpful in pulling off tonight's program. As most of you know, the Newark History Society started 18 years ago. We put on about 90 public programs over that period. And we also sponsor the Newark Archives Project, which is an online database with descriptions of some 4,000 different archival collections related to Newarkers and to Newark. Well, tonight we're really pleased to focus on 2 of Newark's most important monuments, Gutzon Borglum's Seated Lincoln and his Wars of America in Military Park. We started planning this program about 2 years ago, but it's taken on a new urgency and importance over the past summer with the national debate about the role of monuments in our society. Now, one of the things about monuments, of course, is that they're fixed in place, but the understanding of them, how they're viewed by the public, changes constantly over time. As society asks new questions about our history, and we bring different perspectives to long-standing issues in our society. So our goal tonight is, with our panelists, is to gain a better understanding of why Seated Lincoln and Wars of America were commissioned in the first place, who sculpted them, and how they were viewed at the time and over the intervening decades by Newarkers. There are 3 parts to our program tonight. We're going to start with Natalie Borisovitz with some background on Gutzon Borglum, the sculptor. Natalie is the librarian and head of public services at the John Cotton Dana Library at Rutgers Newark. She also curates the online research guide on the Dana Library's website called the Newark Experience, which I think is the most robust and complete bibliography to matters pertaining to Newark and to the history of Newark. So we're really pleased that she will start us off tonight. And then following her, Guy Sterling will discuss Borglum's Seated Lincoln. Guy is well known to many of you. He's lived and worked in Newark for the last 40 years, much of that time as a reporter for the Star-Ledger, and when he covered the City Hall beat, he knew more about what was happening in Newark than almost anyone. And he's taken a particular interest in the Seated Lincoln statue for more than a decade. He organized the celebration of the Seated Lincoln statue on its 100th anniversary in 2011. And then followed that with a program at the Seated Lincoln Outdoors, marking the 150th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's death in 2015. He has also made an important contribution to public art in Newark because he is the person most responsible for the placement of the statue of US Supreme Court Justice William J. Brennan Jr. on the steps outside the Essex County Hall of Records on Martin Luther King Boulevard. And our final presentation will be by Gordon Bond about the Wars of America monument in Military Park. Gordon and his wife have lived in Newark since 2013. He is a freelance graphic designer, but he's also written 6 books about New Jersey history and hosted the online website Garden State Legacy, which has a vast number of articles about New Jersey history, including a number specifically related to Newark. And Gordon is currently working on a book about the Reverend Hannibal Goodwin's invention of flexible film rolls, and then how he had to battle George Eastman of Kodak for the patent. And his book about that will be forthcoming in the next year or two. Now, Guy has included so many photographs and media in his presentation that he opted to record his presentation, and as did Gordon. And Gordon unfortunately had a death in his family last night, so he's unable to join our panel, but he recorded his presentation in advance, including a fair amount of new and archival video. So we're going to start with Natalie, and with luck, well, first, let me also say that at the end, we're going to have a Q&A, and we're really hoping for a robust discussion. There's a Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and that's where you can record your questions, and we'll take them up after the 3 presentations in that Q&A session. So let's turn it over to Natalie and get her PowerPoint presentation up and start there. Thank you, and I'll be back later.
Good evening. Let me just go to my PowerPoint here. Okay. Okay, so as Tim said, back in January of 2019, when we were planning our programming for the next 2 years, this program was envisioned as something that would give people a chance to learn about 2 of the most important examples of public art in Newark: Gutzon Borglum Seated Lincoln and the Wars of the Americas, and obviously we're still going to do that. But a monument, by definition, is something that commemorates, something that preserves a memory, be it of a person or an event or an idea. And the notion of who and what deserves to be remembered came to be called into question this summer after the killing of George Floyd in May 2020, and the subsequent call to confront the memories of injustice. So you really can't talk about monuments at this point without at least touching on what might be termed the monument reassessment movement. I don't think it has an official name, so we'll just call it that. And initially, the movement focused on those monuments that were overtly associated with racial injustice, especially those 780 monuments among the Confederate memorials still in public spaces. And after Floyd's death, some were filled by protesters, as you see here, others were officially removed. And to be fair, legal attempts to remove a lot of these started long before this past summer. And while the movement started with what might be called low-hanging fruit, monuments to Confederate heroes and the lost Southern cause, it fairly quickly moved on to target public monuments honoring individuals or ideas that could be considered flawed or leading to injustice. And one of the first to actually be targeted was Christopher Columbus, primarily for his participation in the forced labor and enslavement of Taino Indians in the West Indies. So the Boston Columbus in the upper right of your slide there was beheaded in June, and a little later in that month, the city of Newark removed this statue of Columbus from Washington Park. And Mayor Baraka said at the time, "It is a statement against the barbarism, enslavement, and oppression that this explorer represents." The question then sort of becomes, represents to whom? What are we called to remember when we see those statues? Certainly, the Columbus statues weren't erected to commemorate the enslavement of Taino Indians. It's actually unlikely that the vast majority of those who walked past that statue in Newark in the past 50 years had any knowledge of that enslavement at all. And, maybe that is indeed the point. On the bottom right here, what you see is the felled statue of Abraham Lincoln in Portland. While for most Americans, Lincoln is still a hero, there are those who remember him primarily as the one who approved the execution of 38 Dakota after the Dakota War of 1862. And that's what they see when they look at that Lincoln. So then again, the question, what memory? Whose memory? Are Lincoln statues okay in the North, but not in the West? Do we decide what monuments get erected, what monuments get removed, depending on who's walking past them at any time, currently, 50 years from now? Should public monuments ever be erected to honor individuals who are not only invariably flawed, just by virtue of being human, but products of their own time and place? Many say they should not, which seems like a logical conclusion, although not necessarily one likely to be widely accepted. There are just too many people who've been waiting far too long to honor their own heroes. It was recently announced, for example, that Washington Park here in Newark was to be renamed Tubman Square, and a statue of Harriet Tubman was to replace the removed Columbus statue. What about those who commission such works or those who create them? Do we need to make those judgments about those as well? Is who created that particular image somehow imbibing that image with their own flaws? How far do we dig as we reassess? And as we remove these things, isn't there sort of if we pretend that the past doesn't exist, then doesn't the present become completely inexplicable? I think there's lots of questions and concerns, but they're also very much 21st century questions and concerns. The aftermath. Certainly, they would not have been in the consciousness of those of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Public sculpture in Newark, as is the case with most of the country, began appearing in the late 19th century. The Civil War provided heroes to commemorate and memories to preserve. It was the beginning of the American Renaissance period, and within that, the City Beautiful movement, where public works and public sculpture were thought to be important because they were a physical expression of an ideal and could uplift the common man. And that ideal was American and democratic, as they saw America and democracy. They are the product of a particular time and place. So you see on the left, the first public sculpture in Newark, that of General Philip Kearny, the commander of the 1st Jersey Brigade, who was killed in action in 1862. And this statue was installed in Military Park in 1880. And on the right is actually something a little bit different from a lot of those things that were produced around the country. The bronze monument to a favorite son, the inventor Seth Boyden, who, among other things, invented patent leather, which was incredibly important for Newark economy and well-being, and malleable iron, and other stuff as well. And this was erected in Washington Park in 1890. But the most famous public monuments in Newark, by perhaps the most famous artists to create public art in Newark, were those by Gutzon Borglum, who created 5 works for Newark, including the 2 major works that are the focus of today's program. As you can probably tell by looking at these photographs of Gutzon Borglum, he wasn't exactly what you would call a shrinking violet. He always looks like he's posing. There he is in the middle, kind of looking like a Hollywood studio shot there, holding what is probably his gold medal from the St. Louis Exposition of 1904 for the sculpture of the Mayors of the Atomies that is now in the Metropolitan Museum. What's on the left is actually a still from a film strip that was shot in his studio, and of Borglum working on the model for the Wars of the Americas. And you'll see more of that film strip later in Gordon's presentation. So beneath that sort of suave exterior, genius artist gentleman that Borglum seems to be going for in these photographs, we have a very, 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 very complicated man. He was a born salesman and promoter who also had absolutely no problem telling anyone that they and their ideas were stupid or worse. He didn't care about money. He was pretty much permanently in debt, but poured much of his own money into projects that he cared about. He could be incredibly generous to others, and he never expected to be repaid. So when those from whom he borrowed money, and that was pretty much anybody he knew who had money, asked for repayment, he took that as a personal insult and betrayal. Borglum was pretty much, no doubt about it, rabidly anti-Semitic. But he also had many influential Jewish friends who he corresponded with regularly and to whom he had no problem expounding on his views. Like his friend Teddy Roosevelt, he didn't see how his opinion of a group had anything to do with his opinion of an individual. And he was honestly horrified by and publicly denounced the Nazis. Borglum had no problem erecting 4 giant heads of US presidents at Mount Rushmore on what was a sacred Lakota site. But in 1931, he was so appalled by the conditions at nearby Pine Ridge that he wrote to President Hoover about it. Borglum was actually extremely well connected and had access to a multitude of US presidents in his lifetime. And when the federal government wasn't quick enough to respond, he personally organized a campaign to deliver food, blankets, and clothing to the Pine Ridge Lakota community. When Borglum embraced something, he embraced it to the fullest, at least for the duration. He also had absolutely no problem with self-delusion. When he received the commission to sculpt the Confederate National Memorial at Stone Mountain in Georgia, his first truly monumental monument, he tried to raise money for the project by selling it as a national and not just a Southern monument. "We are simply happy," he wrote, "that America can give us a Lincoln and a Lee, and we are thrice happier that we have reached an hour and a day when we can all honor each, all glory in the purity of purpose of each." Of course, they hadn't actually reached that day in 1918, or pretty much in 2020 for that matter. Borglum was on and off a member of the Republican Party, but was always looking for that political party, that political group that would be able to throw off the yoke of what he saw as urban Eastern corruption and return to the purity and high ideals of Western agrarianism. He considered himself a Westerner and believed that the farmer was the heart of the nation. He was a founding member of the National Progressive Party, a founder and leader of the Progressive Party of Connecticut. He was a member of the Nonpartisan League. He was on the board of the Interracial Council, the races in this case being Irish, Poles, and Lithuanians, among others, that lobbied for an unrestricted immigration and Americanization of these races. He hosted a large training camp for Czech freedom fighters on his estate in Connecticut. And yet he's usually described as being extremely anti-immigration. Borglum idolized Abraham Lincoln. When working on his portrait of Lincoln that is now in the US Capitol, he read everything that he could find by and about Lincoln. He named his son, who was beyond a doubt the most important person in Borglum's life, Lincoln. In 1910, writing on The Beauty of Lincoln, he talks about Lincoln fulfilling his compact with himself, with God, freeing 4 millions of slaves. It was godlike. And yet he also became associated with the Ku Klux Klan. He always claimed that he was never a member, but he was under the obligation of deep friendship to many of the most prominent leaders. And really, ultimately, it probably doesn't matter if he took the oath or not. I actually think he probably did not. But at least during his later time at Stone Mountain and into the early 1920s, he was deeply involved with the KKK and their politics, which at that point were as much anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, anti-Semitic, and anti-labor as they were anti-Black. By 1923, the KKK was being marketed nationwide as a fraternal organization and had over 1 million members. Excuse me, 80% of them outside the South. That was pretty much their high point, if you could call it that. And they very quickly lost most of their membership after that. For Borglum, they were also important as fundraisers for the Stone Mountain Project, although that didn't really work out. There was too much infighting. And as they were primarily a rural organization, Borglum thought that they would be sympathetic to an agrarian populist movement and that they could be molded into a national political party that would remove America from the control of those corrupt big city bankers. That didn't work out either. Borglum always thought big. He was obsessed with the idea of creating something truly monumental, first at Stone Mountain and then at Mount Rushmore. And you can see Borglum climbing up Washington's nose there at Mount Rushmore, creating something that would last for millions of years and reflect that glory that he thought was America, his idea of America, and would, incidentally, of course, preserve his memory as well. In Newark, Borglum's bronze of the Wars of the Americas certainly adheres to his love for the heroic and monumental. Here on an urban scale, he didn't have a mountain to work with. But in his work, he is also capable of great intimacy and accessibility. So Borglum's seated Lincoln is almost never pictured alone and is often surrounded by children. And this is pretty much the way it was from the beginning. So on the right, we have Lincoln on the cover of a 1912 issue of The Masses, the highly innovative socialist-oriented magazine of art and politics, and then a Star Ledger article from the 1950s. But I'll let Guy Sterling tell you the full story of Newark's seated Lincoln.
What the Eiffel Tower is to Paris and the Houses of Parliament are to London. over the years, there's little doubt it still holds a special spot in the hearts of many as a place of protest, commemoration, self-reflection, and self-expression more than 100 years after its dedication. But the Lincoln statue, located outside Essex County's historic courthouse, was always considered special by the man who conceived and crafted it, sculptor Gutzon Borglum. Its significance was further enhanced when it was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1995. It's a piece of art that's also had at least 3 serious poems written about it. While Borglum and 2 of his sculptures in Newark will serve as the focus of our discussion tonight, there's someone else who's equally important to this story. That person is Amos Van Horn, the Civil War veteran who left the money in his will to pay for Borglum's Lincoln and Wars of America statues, along with the George Washington statue in Washington Park by a different sculptor. Van Horn lived from 1840 until 1908. He was of Dutch descent, and his ancestors were farmers who were among the earliest settlers in Warren County. Amos was born the second of 9 children in Danville, a small Warren County town that's no longer on the map. His father was the proprietor of a general store, where Amos learned about business. The Van Horn family moved to Newark in 1855, but returned to Warren County the following year during the national financial panic of 1856. But Amos came back, and in 1860, with $5 borrowed from one of his brothers, opened a small furniture repair shop on Market Street with a partner. At the start of the Civil War, with the furniture repair business slowing down, Van Horn added a second-hand furniture store to his repair shop, and it prospered. But as the war progressed, Van Horn eventually answered the call to duty and signed up for military service in the 26th Regiment New Jersey Volunteers after selling his business for $25. 3 of his brothers also served in the Civil War, with one of them getting captured in the Battle of Bull Run and dying not long after his release as the war continued raging. Van Horn saw combat action, and his brigade was cited for gallantry. He was mustered out of the military in June of 1863 and returned to Newark to start up a business again on Market Street, this time on a grand total of $200. Almost from the outset, the home furnishing store at 73 Market Street, where Galleria Faro is located today, was successful. Over time, Van Horn added storage and warehousing along with carpet cleaning to his operation, both expanding its footprint on Market Street and growing the business into a large and profitable enterprise. For many years, Van Horn and his wife, the former Emma Clark Wilcox, lived at 88 North 7th Street in Newark, and he was looked upon as one of the city's leading citizens. Around the turn of the 20th century, Van Horn sold stock in his company, and in July 1906, control of the business passed out of his hands to a successor firm. But Amos remained active in the new business as a director and vice president. In 1907, Emma Van Horn, who was a descendant of Abraham Clark, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, died after 35 years of marriage, leaving Amos alone since they had no children. At that point, Amos began giving away his accumulated wealth to charitable causes, usually anonymously through third parties. The recipients often included his old Civil War comrades who'd fallen on hard times. Van Horn died the day after Christmas in 1908, pretty much out of cash from all the money he'd given away, but there was still $500,000 in real estate in his name to be liquidated. The will authorized Van Horn's executors to pick out the spot for the Lincoln statue, although he expressed a preference for either Lincoln Park or out in front of the courthouse. Leaving behind the 3 statues was an act of patriotism to Van Horn. In total, they cost $150,000, $25,000 apiece for the Washington and Lincoln statues, and the remaining 2/3 for Wars of America, which initially went by another name. Van Horn was also keenly interested in aiding the cause of the survivors who'd fought on the side of the Union in the Civil War, and he did so with his involvement in the veterans organization known as the Grand Army of the Republic, or GAR. There were 7 GAR posts in Newark, and it was in the name of the post that Van Horn was a charter member of that the Lincoln statue was deeded to the city. That was Lincoln Post number 11, and thus the official name of the Lincoln statue situated at the convergence of Springfield Avenue and Market Street is the Lincoln Post Monument. The deed, by the way, is sitting in a frame on the wall of the city clerk's office in Newark as one of the more valuable historic documents the city owns, and also one of its most vulnerable. The Lincoln Post Monument in Newark, along with other statues around the country, came on the heels of the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition in 1893 that showcased the work of many great public sculptors. It was that exposition that inspired Newark and other large cities in the U.S. in the late 19th century to begin embellishing their public spaces with art. And just so we're clear, the Lincoln statue in Newark was not the first or the last monument to depict Lincoln in a sitting position, or necessarily the best-known one. There's one in Chicago's Grant Park, which predates the Newark Lincoln, while another in Madison, Wisconsin came afterward. There are others as well, some even based on Borglum's rendering in Newark. Another misconception is that the Lincoln statue in Newark served as the model for Daniel Chester French's massive statue inside the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. In his biography of French, Lincoln scholar Harold Holzer noted that French was much older and already well established by the time Borglum began getting noticed on the American art scene. According to Holzer, French considered Borglum an ill-mannered upstart. In fact, French had such personal disdain for Borglum that he succeeded in convincing the Metropolitan Museum, where he was a trustee and head of the Sculpture Commission, to reject acquiring one of Borglum's pieces for its permanent collection. So it's not likely French would have based any of his work on something of Borglum's, particularly the one that French considered the crowning achievement of his career. But Borglum's star rose quickly, and he was no stranger to the task of sculpting Lincoln, since he'd already sculpted the 6-ton marble bust of the former president that sits in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda in Washington, D.C. A reproduction of that bust sits at the entrance to Lincoln's tomb in Springfield, Illinois. Borglum badly wanted the Lincoln Commission in Newark, but was not interested in competing for it, as was initially envisioned by a 3-member monument committee. One of the committee's members was John Cotton Dana, preeminent librarian and a founder of the Newark Museum. Ultimately, Borglum was able to secure the job by submitting a model for the statue that was approved immediately. Borglum's friendship with Ralph Lum, a prominent Newark attorney and chief executor of Van Horn's estate, was key in Borglum getting hired. Borglum was given the commission in 1909, right after he'd been awarded an honorary master's degree by Princeton. It can be safely said that Borglum's affinity for Lincoln bordered on the obsessive. As a point in fact, he named his only son after the former president. For 2 years, Borglum immersed himself in the Lincoln Project, studying everything about the former president he could get his hands on, and talking to anyone who could give him a perspective on Lincoln that he may have overlooked. Borglum also took exacting measurements of one of Lincoln's life masks, learning it by heart. Lincoln had 2 life masks made, one completed in 1860 and the other in February of 1865, just before his assassination. From the mask, Borglum concluded that the right side of Lincoln's face was more expressive than the left, something that comes through clearly in his statue. Here's how Borglum put it. His right side was determined, developed, ancient. The left side was immature, plain, and physically not impressive. Borglum began the sculpting process by making several small clay models, and he enlarged the image along the way. At his side at all times was a vast collection of Lincoln photographs that he referred to in shaping his image. He completed the clay model for the statue at his studio on 38th Street in Manhattan. It was one of the last pieces he finished there before moving his workplace to the countryside outside of Stamford, Connecticut. The Lincoln Post Monument in Newark, 1.5 times life-size, was cast in Providence, Rhode Island as a single piece, rather than being cast in multiple pieces and welded together. Having it cast in one piece was said to have added 40% to the statue's cost, an expense Borglum incurred because he felt it would add to his work's stature and beauty if it didn't have seams. Borglum also paid for some of the site work at the statue's location. Preparation of the site included removal of some trees that needed to be approved by the city's Shade Tree Commission, one of the more powerful quasi-public authorities in Newark at that time and for years afterward. Borglum's casting of Lincoln in a seated position on a bench did not occur by happenstance. In studying Lincoln's life, Borglum took note of the president's practice of slipping away to the White House garden and sitting when he felt particularly overwhelmed by the dispatches he was receiving from the front lines of the Civil War. As Lincoln described it, these were visits to his personal Garden of Gethsemane, and that's how Borglum approached the piece. To a certain extent in conceptualizing the work, Borglum also used a model of the famous statue of the Thinker by Rodin, a sculptor he knew from the time he'd spent learning his craft in Europe earlier in his career. This is what Borglum had to say about what he was trying to capture in his Lincoln Post monument. The Lincoln I have endeavored to portray is not thinking about himself or anything that will be of advantage to himself. His mind is engrossed with the vast responsibilities that have weighed him down. The statue was dedicated on Memorial Day 1911, in the years when Memorial Day was observed on May 30th. It was also a high holy day on the GAR calendar. The keynote speaker was former President Teddy Roosevelt, whose appearance in Newark was a very big deal. On dedication day, Roosevelt and Borglum, who were friends, along with Borglum's wife, came over to New Jersey from New York City by way of ferry and then by open car to Newark. The newspapers estimated that 100,000 spectators lined the route to Newark just to get a glimpse of Roosevelt. In Newark, they found a crowd of between 25,000 and 40,000 waiting for them in the streets and open spaces around the courthouse, depending upon which newspaper estimate you believe. In addition to the statue's unveiling and Roosevelt's address, the ceremony featured speeches by Estate Executor Ralph Lum, Newark Mayor Jacob Hausling, and Mahlon Pitney, who was New Jersey's chancellor, a position that no longer exists, but then was basically the administrator of the state court system. There were also band renditions of the Star-Spangled Banner, Marching Through Georgia, and America, as well as a reading of Walt Whitman's famous poem lamenting Lincoln's death, O Captain, My Captain. Lum served as the master of ceremonies. The order of business was fairly simple and took place after the unveiling. Because organizers feared the day might be hot, and it was, and feared as well for people's safety if the crowd was large, which it was, the ceremony was designed to move quickly and exactly as was laid out in the event's printed program. As might be expected, dignitaries and VIPs got tickets to the event so they could be up close. And being up close was important, since the papers reported the next day that the speakers couldn't be heard beyond 100 feet from the speaker's platform. On behalf of the trustees of the estate, Chancellor Pitney turned the statue over to Van Horn's GAR post. In so doing, Pitney noted that Borglum, in his statue, had not only captured the heavy psychic burden Lincoln was carrying, but also a quote-unquote serene confidence in the righteousness of his cause. Immediately after Pitney spoke, post number 11 turned the statue's title over to the city, with President Roosevelt and Mayor Hausling doing the accepting. Roosevelt spoke first, and his was the longest speech of the day, lasting between 15 and 20 minutes and delivered without benefit of notes. His words were quoted verbatim in the newspaper the next day, and they've been reprinted any number of times since then. Much of the early part of Roosevelt's speech was directed to the contingent of surviving Civil War veterans who'd gathered for the occasion. Roosevelt told them, "You warred for the union of the American people. You warred for the abolition of slavery throughout the world, for it failed everywhere if it failed here. You warred also for the success of genuine popular government throughout the continents and the hemispheres." But Roosevelt also spoke to his larger audience, many of them newly arrived immigrants, saying that Lincoln rallied Americans by appealing to their sense of duty rather than to their rights. And it was that sense of duty that Roosevelt insisted should continue to inspire Americans to support just causes, just as it had inspired the Union soldiers and sailors of the Civil War. He said it this way: "The true way in which we, the men and women of today, can show that we do in our souls, and not merely with our lips, pay homage to the men of the mighty past, is to face our work, our duties, today in the spirit in which they face their duties." Roosevelt concluded his remarks by again referencing Lincoln and calling on all Americans to dedicate themselves to serving Lincoln's ideals. He said as follows: "We prove our faith in him and his teachings, not merely by praising him for what he did facing the issues of a buried past, but by working in his spirit of love and liberty, of love of justice, of insistence upon order as the handmaid of liberty and justice." Mayor Housling ended the day's speeches with a note of thanks to the executors of Van Horn's estate, to the members of GAR Post Number 11, and to Borglum, saying to the sculptor, "Here is Lincoln as he was in life." And in a bit of revisionist history, since Newark had not voted for Lincoln either in the election of 1860 or 1864, Housling added, "In no city of the country could a statue of Lincoln be more appropriately placed than in Newark." The statue's unveiling was the culmination of a massive Memorial Day parade that had been held in Newark for many years and was highlighted for a long time by the presence of the city's Civil War veterans. The Newark Evening News, which put out an edition in the afternoon of the statue's unveiling, estimated that the parade's procession numbered 5,000 marchers. The paper also took note of the shrinking number of Civil War veterans participating in the 1911 parade. The paper wrote as follows: "Their depleted ranks told the story of time, as did the faltering step of some of the marchers. It was the smallest number of Civil War veterans yet in any annual parade here. Some who insisted upon marching were so weak that they had to be assisted by their more stalwart comrades or their sons." Newark Civil War veterans continued to hold a position of great prominence in the city's annual Memorial Day parade until they were no longer mobile or their ranks died out. For many years after its dedication, the Lincoln statue also served as the focal point of an annual commemoration of Lincoln on his birthday, February 12th, another tradition that has come and gone in Newark. There is a famous photograph of baseball trailblazer Jackie Robinson standing by the statue in Newark with some children while he was still an active player. What's not so well known is that his visit came on Newark's observance of Lincoln's birthday. Almost from the day of the dedication, the image of Lincoln in repose in Newark has been featured on the cover of magazines, used in ads, and also been dusted off when a newspaper editorial needed a symbol of equal justice under the law. The image can also be found on postcards, plates, dishes, pins, paperweights, buttons, medallions, and bookends, almost any commemorative object you can name. Also available were smaller replicas of the statue in varying sizes. Many of these items were for sale from the day of the dedication or shortly thereafter, and you can find some of them for sale on eBay today. But probably most noteworthy of all, the statue has been a place where parents, for every generation of Newarkers since the piece was installed, have brought their children to play, be photographed, or get a quick history lesson. Borglum, by the way, was very much in favor of children, or anyone for that matter, coming into contact with his work right from the dedication ceremony when he stepped in and stopped a policeman from shooing a curious boy with an outstretched hand away from the statue. Despite the substantial success he enjoyed in his career, Borglum never forgot his statue in Newark. This is what he wrote about it in a letter to a friend in 1915. "I was determined to try the experiment of creating a piece of museum sculpture for the public square instead of the conventional monument and see what happened. I am pleased to say it has been a complete success. I don't think I've got a statue in the country as a piece of art that my conscience reverts to and my heart reaches out to surround as naturally and as often as the Newark Lincoln." Roosevelt shared the same sentiment about the Lincoln statue, as well as warm thoughts when recalling his visit to Newark in 1911. In writing to a friend years later, he offered the following: Let me say, the more I see of that statue of Lincoln, the greater I regard it as a work of real art, the lofty soul of a great man expressed as only a genuine artist could express it. I am very glad to have had a chance of being connected with his dedication. Both Lum and Borglum would later say the enthusiastic welcome Roosevelt received in Newark that day played a significant role in Roosevelt's decision to run for the presidency again in 1912. Also in 1912, Chancellor Mahlon Pitney was appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court, where he would serve for 10 years, and Jacob Hausling would be re-elected to his fourth and final term as Newark's mayor. Of the dedication's 4 speakers, Ralph Lum lived the longest, remaining a go-to lawyer in New Jersey until his death in 1952. There is still a law firm in Essex County that carries his family's name. As for Amos Van Horn, he also left a little money in his will to Newark's Fairmont Cemetery, where he, his wife Emma, and other family members are buried under an aging maple tree. The Van Horn plot sits roughly halfway between the Kruger and Fegenspan mausoleums on one side and row after row of Civil War veterans on the other. It's an apt burial spot for Amos, no doubt. As America continues assessing the lives of those historical figures who are memorialized in public sculpture, it makes sense in trying to fully understand the Lincoln statue in Newark to consider the noble purpose that Amos Van Horn had hoped it would serve. Ralph Lum couldn't have been clearer about his friend and client's intent when he said this on Dedication Day in 1911. It was a cause of keen regret to Mr. Van Horn that those of this city who gave so freely of life and property for the preservation of our nation were in no fitting way commemorated. May this memorial of him, who was perhaps most dear to the heart of our nation, be forever a reminder to posterity and the lasting debt owed to Lincoln and all who helped in his life's work. So in the final analysis, the statue was meant as a tribute to each and every American who had contributed in some way to keeping the nation whole and free of slavery, with Lincoln serving as the universal symbol of those many and varied sacrifices. To put it another way, Amos Van Horn had wanted his statue of Abraham Lincoln in Newark to be an enduring testament to the shared costs of freedom. I thank you for your time this evening.
Well, thank you, Guy. That was terrific. And while we're loading up Gordon Bond's presentation, I want to remind you to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen so that we can have some questions that we can ask both Natalie and Guy. Certainly a number are occurring to me, but I hope that many of you will ask questions. And I suspect most of you are learning as much as I am with the 2 presentations so far. And Gordon's, I think, will be just as good.
Sitting at the heart of Newark's downtown is an example of the grand excessive ambition with which Gutzon Borglum could approach his art. The bare statistics alone are impressive. The sprawling tableau of his Wars of America measures 42 feet long, 18 feet wide, and 17 feet tall. It features 42 individual larger-than-life human figures and 2 horses. It was the largest cast bronze sculpture of his career, and indeed, it was said at the time of its creation to be the largest in the world. Wars of America was the 3rd and most ambitious of the 3 public monuments to have their funding bequeathed to the city of Newark by the will of Amos H. Van Horn. The first of the 3, the seated Lincoln, had also been created by Borglum. And this would be the 4th example of Borglum's work for the city. After seated Lincoln in 1911, he created First Landing Party of the Founders of Newark and Indian and the Puritan, both in 1916. Wars of America, however, would have a longer and more troubled creation. At the end of the bloody Civil War, Americans sought to heal their civic psyche by honoring the sacrifices of their soldiers with public monuments and memorials. Cities and small towns alike were erecting monuments, markers, and tablets. Yet, at the start of the 20th century, New Jersey's largest city still had none. Subscriptions were taken up to help fund such a project, but progress had been slow at best. Among those disappointed by the lethargy was Amos Van Horn, himself having served as a private in Company A of the 26th New Jersey Volunteer Infantry in the Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville campaigns. He was honorably mustered out on June 27, 1863 at Newark, where he went on to make his fortune as a furniture dealer. When he died on December 26, 1908, he was able to leave a trust fund of $150,000 to fund the erection of the 3 public monuments. In his will, Van Horn describes seeing the completion of a soldier's monument as having, quote, always been one of my greatest desires. If it had not been completed by the time of his death, his estate was to bequeath $100,000 from the trust fund for the purpose. By 1920, with the first 2 monuments completed, his estate at last got around to fulfilling his wishes. The logical location for such a monument was Newark's Military Park, and Van Horn's will also stipulated that this was where it should be erected. The 6-acre triangular plot was laid out as part of Robert Treat's original 1666 Puritan settlement as the Middle Commons. It was used as a training ground for soldiers during the French and Indian War and by George Washington's troops during the American Revolution. It was even rumored that Thomas Paine might have begun his essay, The American Crisis, while encamped there. After the Revolution, it became a public park, but was again used briefly as a military encampment during the War of 1812. During the Civil War, it was a site of recruitment for the Union Army. During the First World War, in addition to being a recruitment center, Military Park served as a location of Red Cross and Liberty Loan campaigns. The park was the natural location for the various soldiers' monuments that had been proposed. This one appeared in the Newark Sunday Call newspaper in 1907. None of these plans, however, would come to fruition until 1920. With funding secured by Van Horn's will and an obvious location, the first step was to find an artist to design it. Gutzon Borglum had good reason to think his chances of getting the commission were better than most. His previous works for the city had already solidified his reputation. He conceived of something more than the soldiers and sailors' monuments that had become ubiquitous after the Civil War. Between Van Horn's death in 1908 and the call for designs in 1920, the United States had been involved in 10 more conflicts in the American West, Mexico, Cuba, Nicaragua, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. But it was the more than 117,000 American casualties of the late Great War that inspired a renewed popular interest in military memorialization. Borglum's idea was a monument encompassing all American wars. He wrote enthusiastically of the $100,000, quote, with that much money at my disposal, I can create a monument that will truly do honor to the brave men who have served America in times of war. His first inclination was for a more traditional design, a column surrounded by statues of soldiers from the wars to date in heroic action poses. But then a broader idea suggested itself, the concept of the citizen soldier. The United States had a professional military establishment, but its strength came from citizens joining or being conscripted for a limited time. This was rooted in the distrust of standing armies dating to the nation's founding. Thomas Jefferson had been particularly opposed to such standing armies, having witnessed from experience what they could mean when under the control of a monarch. In 1789, he described them as, quote, instruments so dangerous to the rights of the nation that governments should be restrained from keeping such instruments on foot but in well-defined cases. Instead, when the need for an army arose, it would come from able-bodied men in the community who would return to civilian life once the danger had passed. The potential risks and sacrifices would therefore be shared, giving citizens a clear vested interest in the decision of the nation to make war. It was to this ideal that Gutzon Borglum wanted to pay tribute. In the chicken coop turned studio behind his Stamford, Connecticut home, he crafted sketch models from clay and plaster until he had something he felt confident in submitting. In February 1921, Ralph E. Lum, a Newark lawyer who represented the Van Horn estate, announced Borglum the winner of the competition, but it was said the choice was made on the strength of his reputation alone, and that the committee hadn't even looked at his sketches. Borglum described his design, first titled The Mobilization of America, for a newspaper. What I have finally produced is a group of men separating themselves from their civil occupations and home ties, assembling, organizing, and arming and moving forward, carrying with them the accoutrements and implements of war. The action of the composition represents a people summoned to defend ideals. The group is placed upon an incline to emphasize the struggle and show the upward character of it. Back of the entire group is a soldier bidding goodbye to his wife and children, indicating in a very simple and descriptive manner the motive which induces a peaceful nation to take up arms. The agreed-to deadline was for the monument to be completed by 1923, though some fellow sculptors believed anything so ambitious might take as long as 20 years to finish. By this point in his career, however, Borglum was used to thinking big. He'd been working on the designs for the Confederate monument at Stone Mountain, Georgia in 1915, which was planned to be carved into the side of a mountain. He asserted, quote, "Any puny statue could never tell the heroic story of the American soldier and sailor." Borglum's first challenge for the Newark job was finding a space large enough to work in. His studio was already taken up by an equine statue of Union General Philip Sheridan, destined for a park in Chicago. So he began the process of building the armatures in a field outside his studio, and hired builders to start constructing a new studio literally around him as he worked. When the stone walls were high enough, his wife sewed together tarps for a roof that were later replaced by an old circus tent. He was assisted in hauling the 40 tons of clay that would ultimately go into the piece by two assistants, Luigi Del Bianco and Hugo Villa. The process of molding the clay into the huge forms was hard physical work. On nice days, Borglum's wife, Mary, and their children, daughter Mary and son Lincoln, would bring lunch and urge him to take a break. But Borglum was possessed of a perfectionist streak. Dissatisfied with a given figure, he would tear it down and start over. One sailor in particular was made and remade multiple times. Months went by and delays mounted. His attentions were drawn away by problems with Stone Mountain and, in 1922, the death of his brother, Solon Borglum, at age 53 from complications following an appendectomy. Harsh winters didn't help either, as rain and sleet leaked through the tent roof. The modeling clay froze despite bonfires as he labored in fur coat and hat. Borglum, of course, could not work with gloves, and his hands were sore and bleeding. The delays led Ralph Lum to wonder if the criticisms of the scale of Borglum's concept were correct, and that he would not only miss the deadline, but end up way over budget. His concerns only deepened when he learned that Borglum was having a hard time finding a foundry that could cast such a huge sculpture. One quote was for $120,000, when the total Van Horn bequeath had been $100,000. But Borglum was deaf to suggestions that he scale down the monument. Biographers later noted how obstinate he could be. Refusing to compromise, he kept writing foundries for quotes until, at last, he found one in Italy. Gutzon Mcnally would do the job for $20,000. Missing the 1923 deadline, the final parts were shipped for casting in the summer of 1924. Further delays meant the already rescheduled November 11, 1925 unveiling had to also be canceled. His patience strained, Lum lamented to Borglum how he was trying to put the subject out of his mind, quote, "until someone tells me there is some chance of getting the monument during my lifetime." Borglum replied simply, "Trust me a little longer." Public interest in the project had to be maintained throughout the delays. Borglum himself gave an interview on WOR radio in March 1924. The station broadcast out of Bamberger's department store in Newark, where the plaster models were put on display in their windows. When Borglum had to be away to tend to the also troubled Stone Mountain project, Mary took over corresponding with Mcnally in Italy. When the castings were completed, getting them from the foundry to the dock was complicated by their massive size. They tried building a custom truck, but local authorities refused to let them use it on their streets. He told her, quote, "We therefore put 8 string horses to a wagon. They were accompanied by a crew of electricians because in many of the towns, electric wires had to be removed before the wagon with this giant load could pass. Once safely in Newark, the pieces were assembled, and the dedication could at last be scheduled, May 31st, 1926. Depending on the source, the crowds on hand to witness the event were anywhere from 5,000 to 20,000. The discrepancies might have something to do with whether the count limited itself to those within Military Park alone, or included the many more in the surrounding streets or watching from the windows of nearby buildings. At the appointed moment, Alice May Ware, the grandniece of Amos Van Horn, drew apart the flag that had been covering the monument, and 2 large yellow balloons carried off a flag of Newark to complete the dramatic unveiling. Among the more curious parts of the celebration was the release of 96 homing pigeons, 2 for each of the then 48 states of the Union, allegedly carrying messages to their respective governors, though how many managed to complete their voyages home remains unclear. In addition to Borglum, speakers included Governor Harry A. Moore, Brigadier General Hugh A. Drum, and Navy Secretary Curtis Wilbur. Hundreds of soldiers, sailors, and Marines marched on foot, while others on horseback pulled caissons of artillery late of the battlefields of France. Borglum had been running about making last-minute arrangements and was still in his work clothes when he took to the stage. He seems to have been sincerely overwhelmed by the moment of triumph as he improvised, quote, "It would be impossible for me to express the pleasure and gratitude to God that I am able today to deliver to you this memorial monument to the people who have founded and protected a new freedom in the world." Those who came to admire Wars of America could search for figures patterned after real people. Amos Van Horn was represented as a young Union Army volunteer, something he had actually been in 1861. A father and son were modeled after Borglum and his son, Lincoln. The World War aviator was fashioned after John Purroy Mitchell. He had been known as the Boy Mayor when he served as New York City's mayor from 1914 to 1917. When he lost re-election, he joined the Air Service as a flying cadet and achieved the rank of major. He lost his life in a freak accident during a training flight in Louisiana on the morning of July 6, 1918, when his plane went into a sudden nosedive. His seatbelt had evidently been unfastened, and he fell out of the aircraft, plummeting some 500 feet to his death. The monument sits atop a granite pedestal made from stone evidently quarried from Stone Mountain, Georgia. Viewed from above, it forms the handle of a reflecting pool in the shape of a sword, and the motif was carried through to the surrounding fence. Some years later, Borglum traveled to Italy to visit the Mcnally Foundry. The owner asked him an odd question. How did he like the champagne? What champagne? Borglum replied. It seems that the workers had stashed bottles of bubbly inside the hollow bronze castings as a gift that never made it to Borglum. What became of them remains a mystery. Wars of America was unusual when compared with the war memorials of the time. Rather than lionize the exploits of an individual commander, or of some generic soldier or World War I doughboy, it symbolized the collective ideal of a free people rising to take up arms in defense of a cause. One figure was even said to represent a conscientious objector arguing with a recruiter. If true, it adds a degree of nuance to the piece, embracing the reluctance with which the people might make war. Gutzon Borglum's association with the KKK, Stone Mountain, and personal views on white supremacy are all problematic today. Arguably, the ideal embodied in Wars of America could be seen as less controversial. As such, it raises the question of if we can separate the artist from their art. At what point do the perceived personal flaws of the individual outweigh the artistic merits of their work? Is this Borglum's monument, or does it ultimately belong to the people of Newark to interpret and even reinterpret? Setting Borglum aside, however, Wars of America could also be seen as a reminder that the United States hasn't always lived up to the ideals it represents. Critics of 20th and 21st century wars see in them acts of imperialism or fighting for elite corporate interests. In this, it is perhaps unfortunate that Borglum did not stick with his first name for the piece, the mobilization of America. The name Wars of America implies it celebrates the specific wars, not necessarily a citizen-soldier ideal. As a public space, Military Park has outgrown its martial roots. Aside from being a place for recreation and leisure, it has been the gathering place for demonstrations and protests, from the Civil Rights Movement to Occupy Wall Street to Black Lives Matter. The very militaristic theme of the park was challenged in 2019 when New Arts Justice and the Monuments Lab co-curated their A Call to Peace temporary public art installations. They challenged Wars of America by organizing around a central question: what is a timely monument for Newark? As Americans remove, reinterpret, recontextualize, and add new monumental art to their public spaces, the questions these processes raise are by no means simple. Yet, by acting as a catalyst for such important conversations, these public monuments are serving a purpose perhaps unimagined by their creators.
Well, that's the end of Gordon's presentation, and now time for Q&A. We have some questions that have come in, and I would encourage others to type them in, and I'll do my best to relay them here. Gordon, first an easy one, but is the Van Horn home on 7th Street still standing?
No.
Much of
But
that.
you know, there are people up there who remember it as one of the great homes up there. It has not been knocked down all that long. I'm told maybe 20 years, 25 years max.
And Guy, there's also a question about whether Black Civil War veterans from Newark marched in those Memorial Day parades. Do you know?
I do not know that.
Yeah, I know I was once at the Library of Congress going through the muster rolls for the various, what they called colored troops. And they were mustered mostly down in Trenton and other nearby areas, not often in Newark. And this was also before the Great Migration, but there certainly would have been Black Civil War veterans in Newark. And one
The newspapers didn't make the distinction.
Yeah, okay. And you know, and then Ann Gordon asked a follow-up question about whether there was any role for the Black population in the unveiling or the dedication of the seated Lincoln.
Not that I came across.
Yeah. And Natalie, Gail Malmgren's asking whether you can say something about why the Stone Mountain project fell apart. And was it was his work there destroyed by those who hired him? Do you know?
Yeah, no, it wasn't. He destroyed it. He did things like that. Well, I mean, Stone Mountains, the commission started, and he started working there before World War I. And then obviously everything came to a halt. So there was a gap. Borglum always, when he was enthusiastic about a project, he always assured those who were commissioning the project, who usually had something much smaller in mind, that he would have no problem raising at least part of the money from public funds. And while he always promised that, it was actually never true. So there was always far too little money to do the project that he was looking to do. He was also, once the war was over and returned to Stone Mountain, he was also involved in a bunch of other projects. So the group that was sort of coordinating the whole thing was also concerned that his attention wasn't fully on Stone Mountain. He was actually, I think he was actually in DC. He had convinced Congress to mint a memorial coin to Stone Mountain that could be sold in order to raise money. And he was actually working with the US Mint to do so. And I think he was actually in Washington working on that when they decided at Stone Mountain that this was going too slow. There wasn't enough money. He had made the models and they were just going to fire him, take his models and just have somebody else do the monument. His assistant immediately contacted him to tell him this was happening. He came back and he basically destroyed the models. So no one else could actually put up his monument. And then he hightailed it out of town with them behind him because they felt he had destroyed something that belonged to them. So there were all kinds of warrants out for his arrest and stuff like that. But it wasn't so much they destroyed it. He initially destroyed the models, and then I think what finally got put up there, they hired someone else to do it. They didn't actually able to do it. I think there was nothing really there until 1970.
You know, it's interesting that so much of the discussion today about monuments is how newer monuments tend to be experiential and participatory. And in some ways, it appears that Borglum anticipated that, certainly with the seated Lincoln, by encouraging the people to touch it and sit there, and or as Guy, you said that he discouraged a county a policeman from shooing somebody away.
Yeah, small boy, yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You meant, is there more in his papers or from what you've read about his focus on making it, if I can call it participatory or experiential in that way?
Well, you know, this piece is sometimes thought of as one of the first museum pieces in the public square. And in that sense, you know, Borglum wanted people to get as close to it as possible. He didn't want people to see this as just what he called a conventional monument. He wanted it to be looked at as art, a museum piece, but he wanted people to interact with it. And in the days since the dedication of the Lincoln statue, more and more sculptors have adopted and embraced that same philosophy. So that in a way, I think the Lincoln statue, if not the first, was certainly one of the first in the country that you know, carried this philosophy with it. That there was to be an interaction with people. He wanted kids to touch it. He wanted people to get close to it and to put their fingers on Lincoln's face and to feel the emotion, to feel the pain, to feel the burden that Lincoln was carrying, because he felt, you know, that was the way that they could really, in some small way, experience what Lincoln had gone through.
And if I can also add to that, you know, Borglum was a friend and a great admirer of Frank Lloyd Wright, and that whole notion of making something part of the environment, not standing apart. And I think there's some of that that's seen in the Lincoln as well.
And to some extent, it in the Wars of America as well, because of its not heroic in its way. The heroism comes from the commitment of the common person to take part, rather than in some larger than life figure. I've always been moved by I think there's a part of someone tending a wounded soldier, and that conscientious objector, and then the scene of the soldier leaving behind his wife and two children. Guy, you have a note here from Borglum's granddaughter, Robin Kennedy, who says that she, as you invited her to join this, but she's communicated with you for years via email and phone, and she's delighted to see you and to hear the story and the result of your years of research. And she's really grateful to you for alerting her to this presentation.
Well, thank you. Robin and I used to speak when I was a reporter at the Star-Ledger, and she's very knowledgeable about her grandfather's work. She's written about it in a book, and she keeps his legacy alive. I still makes appearances, as far as I know, when called upon to represent his work. So it's very nice to have her here. And to me, it adds something to the program.
And Natalie, she's added a comment that the coin that you mentioned was completed and was sold to raise money. Stephen Schaefer has asked about the role of the Newark Schoolmen's Club in erecting public monuments in Newark, because he remembers contributing as a student, but they had no role in these monuments, did they?
No.
They put up tablets in various places around the city.
Yes. Some of which are still there, and some of which have unfortunately gone the way of the scrapyard, I guess. I don't know, but there are, you know, it's be a worthwhile project to find out which ones are there, which ones aren't, and to maybe even replace the ones that aren't, because they were. It was such a collaborative and special movement to draw students, the Newark Public School students, into the history of the city like really nowhere else I've ever found. And the ones that are still there are very nice. They're all kind of this, all kind of the same in a way, but they do commemorate different aspects of the city's history going back to its founding, and it was a very worthwhile project.
Right. Let's see here. There's a James Healy is asking what was Robert Lincoln's response to the seated Lincoln? Do you know?
Don't know.
Don't know. And another person is asking, what's a good recent modern biography of Borglum that you can recommend?
You know, Robin's book is very good.
And under what name though is that? Is it under Kennedy or is it?
I think Carter, Robin Borglum Carter.
Yeah, well, maybe she can type it into this.
Kennedy, I think.
Yeah.
Kennedy, okay.
Yeah, Robin Borglum Kennedy, okay. There is a question about whether you feel the monuments, given the controversy, should they be removed? And another person is asking, how are they being protected by the city?
Well, the Lincoln statue is actually on county property, so it falls under the protection of the Essex County Sheriff's Office, and they do protect it. As we know from going back to the 70s, there was a fair amount of graffiti that was put on the statue, but that's all been removed. The last I had heard that there was some sort of defacing of it was, I think, going back 3 or 4 years when someone had dumped red paint on it, but that was cleared off. And the statue now, I think, has taken upon a much different spot in people's minds and hearts, because it's become a place where people go to gather, to be heard, to protest. The People's Organization for Progress in Newark uses it all the time as a place to be seen, be heard, to get its message across. And in that sense, I think it's taken upon a new layer of meaning and importance and significance to Newarkers, from people outside of Newark, as they have their causes to advocate. I'd also say that I've seen any number of musicians down there with their saxophones, their guitars, using the statue for inspiration, sitting on that bench, playing away for themselves. It's looked upon by different people for all sorts of reasons, good reasons. And in that sense, I think Newarkers really have adopted it and embraced it, really very, very thoroughly.
Did you have your photo taken there when you were young?
No, but my dad did.
Really?
My dad grew up here, was born in 1918, and he talked about his father died in the flu epidemic of 1918, and then his mother moved up to South Orange Avenue from Oliver Street, and he remembers his mom taking him there when he was a boy. And it was a rite of passage in Newark to be taken to the Lincoln statue, to have something to climb on, to see the president. I want to mention there's a wonderful poem about this statue that was written by he was actually a Supreme Court justice in Vermont who later became a federal judge in Washington, D.C. by the name of Wendell Phillips Stafford. And he wrote a poem called One of Our Presidents. And I can't recommend that poem highly enough to people if they'd like to see it, to read it, because it not only speaks to the time, it speaks to today, it speaks for eternity. The beauty of this poem, it's so well written. Stafford was a published poet as well as being a legal mind, and it is just marvelous. It's the kind of poem that if you know the Lincoln statue and you appreciate it and you treasure it, this poem will bring a tear to your eyes. I guarantee it. It speaks for the ages.
Guy, could you send that to me? Because when I send around a link to the recording of this program to everybody on the Newark History Society list, it would be good to include that.
Oh, absolutely. It's not a long poem, but it starts off talking about the beauty of the poem, but then gets into its meaning, and just sublime.
There was a problem with some people who had a confirmation that this started at 7, asking whether there's a way to gain access to the program. This will be posted on the Newark History Society's YouTube site. Guy, you'll probably put it on your site. Gordon will put it on his Garden State Legacy site.
Right.
But we'll try to get the word out there. There was also a problem at the beginning about the number of people admitted to this. So we'll make sure the recording of this gets around. A couple of comments. The biography of Borglum it's by Robin Borglum Carter, she says. So if you can find it on Amazon. There are a couple comments from the librarians at Newark Public Library commenting that Robert Lincoln, apparently in a book published 5 years ago, has noted that he didn't like the Newark seated Lincoln, but then added that he didn't like most of the Lincoln statues because it felt that he didn't capture the personality, which is hard to see because it's such a powerful statue. Natalie, you kind of covered this in your comments, and let's see if you have something to add. Someone is saying, as was mentioned, protesters in Portland felled the Lincoln statue on Indigenous Day of Rage. And do we as a society honor the living offended by statues, or do we honor those of historical significance? I'm not sure it's a binary situation, but you want to comment on that further?
I think it's a difficult question. I think you do have to look at why monuments were put up, for what reason, because monuments do speak to a particular time and place, and our perceptions obviously change. And but then it's still, I think there's still importance for us to remember what used to be. I think you can't kind of just say, well, it shouldn't have been, they shouldn't have thought that, therefore they should never have put this up, therefore we should just tear this down. I think, again, you need to remember history. And it varies, because I do think that, the Confederate monuments, for the most part, were put up by the United Daughters of the Confederacy starting in the 1890s. They were not works of art. They were very much put up for one reason, and that's so that people didn't forget the Confederacy. They were very pointed in what they were trying to do, but there are also things that are works of art. And Borglum's, people think of Borglum's as giant heads in Mount Rushmore, but he was genuinely a talented artist. And I think we see that in the Newark monuments. So I think there's something to be said, and I think one of the best things is that all these things lead to discussion, and it's in the discussion, I think, that we come to some understanding.
Tim, could I add something about the Wars of America statue? It's my understanding, my reading, I could be wrong in this, but I don't think so, that the Kearny statue was originally in the site where the Wars of America statue is now, and then it was moved, still in Military Park, but that when it was dedicated in, I think Natalie said 1880, both U.S. Grant and General Sherman came to that dedication ceremony, as did McClellan, General McClellan. Now, McClellan, later became governor of New Jersey and lived in, I believe, in Orange. But it was a bitterly, bitterly cold day. And when the time came for the dedication, carriages took it was a big, big luncheon in Newark. It was a really, really big deal that, Grant would come here. And when the carriages took the participants to the statue for the dedication, of course, Grant went to the site and Sherman went to the site because they had great respect for Kearny. But Kearny did not like McClellan, thought he was a coward. Yeah. McClellan did not get out of his carriage in the street to go to the actual dedication at the site because he claimed it was too cold. But there were other people who felt that he knew that Kearny wouldn't want him there because he didn't like him. But then later on, that statue was moved elsewhere in the park, and I'm glad to see that it's still there. Although that statue, has had a little bit of a difficult history as well here, but it's still there. It's looking good, and it's been kind of refurbished in recent years. So.
Yeah, it was actually moved twice. First time for the Wars of the Americas, and then it was moved again when they built the garage. Yeah. So it was shifted twice.
Yeah. We're running up against our time limit. Natalie, do you have a final comment, or and then Guy?
I think the only thing I would say is that when life returns to normal, if you haven't gone and looked at these works of art that are in the middle of Newark, do it. And hopefully, as a result of Guy's and Gordon's presentation, you're going to not only see them, even if you've seen them before, but seeing them maybe with new eyes.
And I would echo that because there's such a history behind these statues, not just, through the years and the fact that when we had a Lincoln's Day observance here, it was held right at the statue, or that there was a ceremony there and it's 100th anniversary. But we need to get back into why they were there, who put them up, what those times were like as we start to, reassess how we look at them today and what we want to do with them. We've got to understand the whole history, and sometimes it's deep, sometimes it's not easy to get to. It takes some study, but it's worthwhile in this whole reassessment that we're having of public art right now, I think.
Yeah. And it's good to bring Amos Van Horn back to the forefront.
Very much so. He's an unsung hero, Tim. He really is.
Yeah.
His workers, he was a beloved employer. They when he left kind of the ownership of the company, his workers just hugged him and said they'd hope he'd stay on, and it was one of the reasons that he did. Just in name only, kind of the way that Bamberger did at Bamberger's department store, because he was his workers loved him so much. But he was very partial to the Civil War veterans and really looked out for them in this city.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Natalie and Guy, and we'll extend our thanks warmly to Gordon as well. This has been a terrific program. The Newark History Society has 4 more programs scheduled this year, 2 in collaboration with NJPAC. With NJPAC, we're going to do one on forgotten Newark riots, 1834, 1854, I think 1914, I think it is. And then that's in March, and then in at the end of May, we'll do one on prohibition and the temperance movement in Newark. This program has been recorded. As I said, we will post it. And we look forward to being able to do these things again live, because and have be able to see the people who are asking the questions and to greet each other. But until that day, this has worked out really well, and I'm grateful to the people at NJPAC for handling all the back of stage issues here. So thank you and good night.
Yep.